So it is distinctly possible that this whole case goes poof because of that in the next month or so. I will be watching to see what happens. Alrighty. Apologies. I do have a touch of a cold going on, so it's going to be a little different today, but try not to talk too much. But I wanted to cover this particular thing that came up while I was off last week. And this, you might have seen me talk about this particular story before from Heterodox STEM Substack, and it points to a different article that discusses in depth the politicization of scientific funding, particularly as related to DEI and DEI statements. And if you've been following along on this channel with me for some time, you know that I think of DEI statements as ideological litmus tests, and they amount to coerced speech. And so having them in grant funding applications as requirements in grant funding applications for any scientist that has to go compete for grant funding from the federal government or others to fund their research and their livelihood, does seem to be a touch of a problem. One of the groups that is mentioned here in this particular article is the Department of Education. Now, all the different cabinet level departments and their sub-agencies underneath, all of them have a specific set of funding. Oftentimes they have offices of science, for example, that actually help, where is it in here? Where's the DOE one? Yeah, here we go. That actually help, to distribute some of the funds that each of these agencies get to different researchers around the country to meet specific priority needs. What the authors of this piece pointed to was that in the case of the DOE specifically, they actually started requiring applicants for their scientific research grants to submit what amounts to a DEI statement, or more precisely, a DEI plan. So, just reading from this article real quick. Agencies require researchers to dedicate resources to DEI activities, and some even recommend the hiring of paid DEI consultants. DEI loyalty oaths are now integral to the evaluation of proposals. How does this look in practice? In a truly Orwellian manner, the DOE, Department of Energy, has pledged to, quote, update the DOE merit review program to improve equitable outcomes for DOE awards. Scientists seeking DOE funding must include a peer promoting inclusive and equitable research plan. DOE encourages applicants to consider the composition of the project team, including project personnel and partnering institutions, as well as, quote, inclusive and equitable plans for recognition on publication and presentations. That is the DOE. Now, there's been some questions here, and this is the fair and logical question that we have to consider. Has anybody been denied a grant funding because their otherwise excellent proposal didn't have this in it, or didn't have it to the specifications of what the DOE would want? Be it, ideologically, this is more left of center what we're talking about than anything, but even if it were on the other side, this would still be inappropriate as far as I'm concerned, so it doesn't matter. And so there's a question of whether or not something like that would be expressly in violation of the First Amendment, and amongst other things. But that hasn't been legally tested yet. And that's where today's bit of news, because this is a few months old now, that's where today's bit of news comes into play. This is Hamilton Lincoln Law Institute, representing a nonprofit group called the National Association of Scholars, has filed suit against the U.S. Department of Energy, as specifically related to what I just mentioned to you about the peer plans. The National Association of Scholars is a nonprofit, and we'll get into that in a second. But let me read the overview, and then I'm going to go into the actual legal brief a little bit, just to let folks know. But the main point, if you're listening so far, is that this is the first time such a case has been tried with respect to grant funding dollars in the US, at least to my knowledge. Others who are a little bit more legally knowledgeable in this might say otherwise, so please tell me if I'm wrong. But to the best of my knowledge, it's the first time something like this has been adjudicated, that the underlying legal question being whether or not the federal government can compel the speech of grant applicants seeking funding dollars from any of the agencies. Now, I would argue the answer is a hard no because that's a First Amendment violation. But compel the speech on topics that are, shall we say, unrelated to the research questions that are the meat and the bulk of the proposal. So let's see. National Association of Scholars versus DOE. Hamilton Lincoln Law Institute, on behalf of the National Association of Scholars, filed a lawsuit challenging the U.S. Department of Energy's requirement that researchers submit a DEI statement with applications for research grants. Now, as I mentioned, it's not quite that, but fine. That's kind of picking nits as far as I'm concerned. The Department of Energy requires all Office of Science. So this is what I was saying before. A lot of the cabinet levels have their own kind of Office of Science, or their different sub-agencies underneath. Like, oh gosh, there's a couple of different ones. There's a few different agencies under different cabinets that do have their own offices of science, for instance, or hand out grant funding. You can find a lot of this if you end up searching on like grants.gov if you're looking and curious about what's going on with that. It's a whole other topic, but this is, the arm of that department in this particular case that we're talking about that awards grant dollars to outside entities, be they universities or companies or what have you, that are trying to get a proposal funded to do research on a particular thing that might meet DOE's particular interest. Now, the different agencies and things will set, the scientific things. These are the scientific questions we are interested in answering. Tailor your proposal to try and answer that. Or topics we're interested in focusing on. But anyway, the Department of Energy requires all Office of Science research grant applications to include a, quote, promoting inclusive and equitable research plan. Through this requirement, applicants must, quote, describe the strategies and activities of the applicant to promote equity and inclusion as an integrated element of the research and development project. The requirement amounts to compelled speech that violates the First Amendment and is further unlawful because it is not authorized by the relevant statutes, nor was it appropriately implemented under the Administrative Procedures Act. Funding for scientific research should adhere to the principles of equal opportunity, non-discrimination, and scientific merit, rather than vague notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Additionally, peer plans prioritize group identity and equity rather than principles of equal opportunity, non-discrimination, and merit. The requirement undermines sound public policy and scientific advancement by compelling researchers to prioritize irrelevant DEI factors instead of focusing on substantive scientific research, and discourages highly qualified researchers from pursuing Department of Energy grant funding. The law firm intends to file a motion to enjoin the Department of Energy from continuing the implementation of the peer plan requirement for scientific grant applications. Okay. This is an interesting piece. This was just filed this past Thursday as of the time of this recording on January 16th, 2025. Now, here's the actual text of the court-submitted documents. And this is where it's interesting, of course, because unless you've not been paying attention, here in the United States, we've just had an inauguration and a new presidential administration, which will mean that a lot of the names listed on here for secretaries and undersecretaries are going to change. And I'm going to get to that in a second as to why it may throw this whole case into a complete upheaval, although, frankly, I do actually still want to see the legal question adjudicated underneath, because it does pertain to how scientists, get a decent amount of funding to do their work. So I would actually very much like to see it adjudicated anyway, but there's a distinct possibility that the case may go poof, and we'll get to that in a minute. National Association of Scholars versus United States Department of Energy. Jennifer Granholm in her official capacity as the Secretary of Energy, outgoing Secretary of Energy, if not out already. Geraldine Richmond in her official capacity as Undersecretary for Science and Innovation. Again, also potentially not in that position anymore. We shall find out. Let's see. The Department of Energy Office of Science is the largest source of funding for basic and advanced scientific research. it is one of the largest, if not the largest. That's a very true statement. For decades, its funding has enabled scientific breakthroughs and human advancement in fields such as high-energy physics, computational science, microelectronics, and energy technologies. They've abbreviated it to SC for the Office of Science, by the way. Beginning in fiscal year 2023, SC adopted an ideological litmus test for researchers who apply for SC research grants. The Promoting Inclusive and Equitable Research Peer Plan requirement mandates that every applicant for SC research grants must commit to how the applicant will promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in research projects. The peer plan is more appropriately characterized as a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, a bold attempt to impose ideological orthodoxy and conformity. Exhibit Headley Declaration 1B through 1. Okay. Legal speak. There's going to be a lot of legal speak involved in this. I'm going to try to avoid that just to get to the meat here. The National Association of Scholars is a tax-exempt nonprofit organization that seeks to reform higher education and adamantly opposes DEI statements, especially with respect to higher education and advanced scientific research because it emphasizes group identity rather than prioritizing scientific merit and sound academic inquiry. Plaintiff challenges the peer plan requirement as a violation of its own and its members' First Amendment rights because the peer plan requirement imposes an unconstitutional condition on obtaining research funding. This is the legal question I want to get. Regardless of whatever you think about the underlying issues, this is actually the legal question that's interesting to me. Does the federal government, as a condition of grant funding, have had the ability to compel your speech on certain things? I say, frankly, no. Is that I would very much agree with the sentiment here, but it is the underlying legal question that really hasn't been terribly tested yet, as far as I know of. It is a quote basic First Amendment principle that freedom of speech prohibits the government from telling people what they must say, end quote. Agency and the government quote may not deny a benefit to a person on a basis that infringes on his constitutionally protected freedom of speech, even if he has no entitlement to that benefit. What this goes to, I think the reason this ended up here, what this goes to is that just because you put in grant funding request, put in a proposal for something doesn't mean you're entitled to it. You're competing with a whole bunch of other people that are probably competing for the same grant dollars, and there's a limited amount to go around. That's just the point. You're not entitled to that benefit. That's one of the reasons they put that in there. The peer plan requirement has nothing to do with the advancement of scientific research. Instead, the requirement is a burden that will erode the integrity of fundamental and applied scientific research. Instead of advancing science and academic freedom, the peer plan requirement prioritizes support for fashionable DEI causes and ideological conformity. The peer plan requirement falls outside the scope of the statutes authorizing SC research funding, again, Office of Science. The inclusion of the peer plan requirement amounts to SC, quote, compelling a grant recipient to adopt a particular belief as a condition of funding, which, quote, places a condition on the recipient of the subsidy rather than that of than on the particular program. Okay, so this is some legal precedent that's existing that they're relying on as they're making this case. I'll be very curious to see what happens with it. Conditioning federal grants on factors unrelated to the underlying statute renders such conditions illegitimate. South Dakota v. DOE, here DEI interests and collateral social missions are absent from the statutory framework authorizing Office of Science research grants. This is an interesting thing to get into, but anyway. The peer plan requirement also conflicts with the accompanying regulations governing Office of Science research grants. It imposes a new duty requirement on grant applicants that previously had not been included in the regulations concerning grant applications and selection. Thus, addition of the peer plan requirement is a substantive rule change that should have been subjected to notice and comment requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act. Okay. So there's two things going on here. First Amendment violations, procedural grounds that should have been thrown out. SC's imposition of the peer plan requirement is also beyond the defendant's statutory authority. The statute authorizing SC grant funding are aimed expressly at furthering basic and advanced scientific research to foster energy independence and strengthen the nation. Injecting DEI requirements into applications for grants or for research grants is at odds with Congress's express intent to provide merit-based SC research funding. Now, this will be interesting actually when and if it's adjudicated, because one of the things that was overturned in the last year, I believe, it was in the last year, by the Supreme Court was the notion of Chevron deference, where you basically defer to legally have to defer to the agency in question. The court, defer to the agency in question with respect to their interpretation of the statute. Well, no, Chevron deference got thrown out, so that's not necessarily what it's supposed to be anymore, at least from my understanding of it. So that'll be interesting to see how it goes with that, because I think that's what they're pointing to with this, is that got overturned. Let's see. Parties, here we go. Plaintiff NAS is a tax-exempt organization under the Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3 with offices in New York. NAS has 3,000 members who are researchers, professors, and academics in multiple disciplines in colleges and universities across the United States. NASA's mission is to uphold the standards of a liberal arts education that fosters intellectual freedom, searches for truth, and promotes virtuous citizenship. Jennifer Granholm, Secretary of Energy, probably now former Secretary of Energy, note to self by the time of reading this. See, what I'm looking for actually is, oh, wait a minute. Okay, I think what I'm looking for, because NAS being the organization is one thing. The biggest question that I have had reading this, and when I read it before, was whether or not NAS had standing for this, because they don't directly engage in going after research grants themselves. They are a nonprofit that represents scholars who do go after those research grants. So the question there is whether or not they themselves as the entity have standing, or are they perhaps representing members who do have standing and have been impacted negatively by the peer plan requirement? This is the question. If it's the latter, then yeah, perhaps NAS is doing the honors of suing on behalf of their members who have had a negative impact from all this. Plaintiff NAS is a tax-exempt organization. NAS members are professors, faculty, and researchers at college universities. NAS publishes a quarterly journal devoted to exploring issues within contemporary higher education, which is decent. I do like it. It's not the best I've ever read, but it's decent. NAS and its members also engage in advocacy by including submitting amicus briefs. Okay. Continued encroachment of DEI programs requiring higher education. NAS as an organization has opposed DEI as a vague, ill-defined concept that stifles open and frank debate and free exchange of ideas, and is a pernicious influence within academia. DEI runs contrary to notions of merit, fairness, and equality that are important to NAS and its members, and to the success of their work, because it entails treating people as members of groups rather than individuals who are to be judged by their merit or individual accomplishments. Let's see. NAS has members that have applied for and in several instances received research funding from the federal government, including SC, as well as other federal agencies such as the Department of Defense and its branch components, the National Science Foundation, NSF, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, NASA, among others. NAS has members that would like to apply for SC grants in the future, but do not believe they should be compelled to incorporate a peer plan statement into a grant application that would require the members to promote a DEI message that they fundamentally oppose. NAS members' ability to participate in federal funding of basic and advanced scientific research should not be conditioned on being compelled to make a statement in adherence to DEI ideology and orthodoxy that is disconnected from and indeed crowds out the scientific merit or value of the proposed research. Okay. And they actually have specific members here. So this is different, because I had thought it was just NAS suing willy-nilly here, but they actually have specific members here that are of interest. Member A, and they've kept the members anonymous. Interesting. Member A has been a NAS member for 13 years. Member A is an engineering professor at a public university in Texas within the Austin division of the Western District. That explains where it was filed. That explains where it was filed. The lawsuit was filed because, well, no, this is somebody on the East Coast. Anyway, Member A has received research within the past year. Member A applied to branch of DOD research, but was eventually informed the funding was no longer available. There was no longer funding available. Member A is currently performing research on atmospheric phenomenon that could be relevant to the energy industry and is a viable topic for SC grant research grant funding. However, Member A, however, will not apply to the SC for research funding because he objects to the peer plan requirement and DEI statements more broadly. Member A believes that DEI unnecessarily politicizes scientific research and undermines the goal of scientific excellence. Okay, so when you're talking about standing, you're usually talking about somebody's either got a stake in this or somebody would be adversely affected as a result. Um, yeah, that might count. I'm not 100%, and we'll actually get into. Oh, good. They have a whole paragraph on standing. Hold on a second. We'll get there. Member B has been a NAS member for approximately 20 years. Member B is an engineering professor at a Tier 1 research university on the East Coast. Member B has a history of applying for and receiving federal grants, including funding from the Department of Energy, NSF, and NIH. Member B is interested in revisiting some earlier research that had been funded by a grant from the Department of Energy. Member B views SC as a potential source of funding for this research, but is not pursuing an SC grant because of opposition to the peer plan requirement. Member B believes that DEI unnecessarily politicized. Okay. NAS members A and B have standing because they are research scientists who previously participated in research funded by the DOE and or other government-funded scientific research projects by agencies such as NSF or the Department of Defense. These and other NAS members have a track record of seeking and obtaining research grants, including from the SC, and are able and ready to apply for SC research grants, but for the peer plan requirement with which they object to as an infringement on their First Amendment rights. NAS and its members fall within zones of interest in the process involved in grant making. Okay. If it were just NAS by itself, I would say they have no standing. I was kind of hoping they'd have members who were already somewhat, lost funding from this. But then again, the peer plan requirement might not have been around long enough for that to happen. But this is close, and it might be okay on standing, because I imagine the DOE might challenge this with regards to you don't really have standing. Well, maybe you do. You got a couple of folks who have been adversely affected and are not willing to apply for grants because of this nonsense. So it's easily that. But anyway, so they are wanting certain things like declaring the peer plan to be unconstitutional infringement of free speech, which is one thing. Peer plan violating the Administrative Procedures Act, which is the sort of thing. There's no statutory authority for imposing that requirement. Peer plan requirement violates the APA because it's a substantive rule change without notice or comment. That's the sort of administrative bureaucratic reason why you might throw this out. They want a declaratory judgment that the peer plan requirement violates the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is contrary to statutory law, and order preliminarily enjoining defendants and their agents from taking any action to enforce or apply peer plan requirement, and order declaring that the defendants did not observe statutory requirements under the APA when introducing the peer plan, order vacating and setting aside the peer plan requirement and permanently enjoining defendants from taking action to enforce or apply, award plaintiff reasonable costs, including attorney fees. Okay. Again, excuse me, have a cold. There's a lot more to this, obviously, because there's a crap ton of evidentiary things that have been put down here, but this is the actual complaint that's in question. Now, we've hit the standing thing, but I mentioned at the top here that we've just had a changeover in administration, and it was one of the first things that got discussed by executive order with the administration, which was ending the DEI stuff in the federal government. So it is distinctly possible that this whole case goes poof because of that in the next month or so. I will be watching to see what happens, obviously, and I'll try to bring it here if I can. But it's distinctly possible the whole case goes poof because the new DOE under new leadership might be like, yeah, you're right, and throw the whole thing out, in which case, no such thing. Now, part of me actually really wants to see this case go forward because I want to see it adjudicated and see what the precedent is so that, we can figure out how this works again in the future. And there is actually some legal precedent should a different department try this or a different administration do things with this. Administration changes happen every 4 years kind of thing. So, or most of the time every 4 years. So that would be the question I have at that. But this is very interesting to see happen, to see it unfold. I don't know how it's going to go. And frankly, if it were a completely different thing, like you making an ideological requirement for something else, I'd still have a problem with it. That's actually not the issue, what the specific thing is. It's more so that you're making an ideological requirement of somebody as part of a grant. And that seems to me to be compelled speech. regardless of whether or not it's a DEI thing or not. As always, links will be in the description for you. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way at the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious.